One of the most confusing things about loving an avoidant person is this. The moment the connection starts becoming real, they often begin pulling away, and for someone on the receiving end, that behavior feels heartbreaking and contradictory, because naturally you assume that emotional distance means loss of interest. You think, if they truly cared about me, why would they suddenly become cold right when we were getting closer? But with avoidance, emotional distance is often triggered not by lack of feelings, but by the intensity of feelings becoming too real. That is what makes the experience so emotionally confusing. See, most people associate love with moving closer emotionally. More vulnerability, more communication, more openness. But avoidants often experience emotional closeness very differently because deep attachment activates fear inside them at the same time. Fear of losing control, fear of emotional dependence, fear of vulnerability, fear of getting hurt. And when those fears activate, their nervous system often reacts by creating distance instead of deeper connection. That's why an avoidant may seem deeply connected one moment and emotionally distant the next. One day they are affectionate, emotionally open, engaged, and present. The next day they suddenly become quiet, distracted, emotionally unavailable, or hard to reach. And if you do not understand avoidant behavior, that shift can make you feel rejected, confused, and emotionally abandoned. But internally, they are often struggling with emotional overwhelm because closeness feels both comforting and terrifying to them at the same time. Part of them wants love deeply. They crave connection, understanding, intimacy, and emotional safety just like anyone else. But another part of them fears what happens when someone gets too emotionally close. Their mind begins associating attachment with pressure, loss of freedom, emotional expectations, or eventual pain. And instead of communicating those fears openly, they retreat. Not always because they stopped loving you, but because vulnerability itself starts feeling emotionally unsafe. This is why many avoidants pull away right after emotionally intimate moments, after deep conversations, after emotional vulnerability, after becoming closer than usual. Because once the emotional connection feels serious, their internal fear system activates and tells them to regain distance before they lose emotional control. And sadly, many relationships break during this stage because the other person reacts by chasing harder, more texting, more emotional pressure, more demands for reassurance, more attempts to force clarity immediately. But emotional pressure usually intensifies an avoidant's fear instead of calming it. The more trapped they feel emotionally, the stronger their instinct becomes to escape the emotional intensity. That does not excuse unhealthy behavior or emotional inconsistency. But understanding the psychology behind it changes the way you interpret their actions. Because an avoidant pulling away is not always proof that the connection meant nothing. Sometimes it is proof that the connection meant too much, and that emotional reality creates one of the deepest contradictions in avoidant relationships. The very closeness they secretly desire is also the thing that scares them most. That's why patience and emotional awareness matter deeply in these situations. Because constantly interpreting their fear responses as total lack of care may cause you to misunderstand what is truly happening internally. Still, one truth remains important. Love alone cannot heal avoidance unless the avoidant person becomes emotionally self-aware themselves. You cannot force someone to feel safe with intimacy before they are ready to confront their own emotional fears. But if you ever notice someone pulling away exactly when emotions become deeper, more vulnerable, and more real, do not ignore the possibility that their distance may be coming not from absence of love, but from fear of how deeply they are beginning to feel it. One of the hardest things about loving an avoidant person is trying to understand what they truly feel emotionally, because avoidants often struggle expressing love through direct words. In many cases, they may care deeply about someone while still appearing emotionally distant, confusing, or detached on the surface. And that contradiction leaves many people emotionally exhausted, because naturally, Most people look for verbal reassurance to feel emotionally secure. They want clear communication, clear affection, clear emotional openness. But avoidants often communicate attachment very differently. Instead of expressing emotions openly, their feelings tend to appear through subtle actions, quiet consistency, and behaviors that reveal emotional connection beneath the surface. That's why with avoidance, actions often reveal far more than words ever do. See, an avoidant person may struggle saying, "I need you," "I'm scared to lose you," or "I'm deeply attached to you," because emotional vulnerability feels uncomfortable for them. Expressing those emotions directly may trigger fear, pressure, or internal discomfort. So instead, their attachment leaks out indirectly through small behaviors they may not even realize are emotionally meaningful. They remember tiny details about your life. They check on you quietly after distance. They notice changes in your mood. They return after pulling away emotionally. They stay connected in subtle ways, even when pretending to be detached. And those behaviors matter because avoidants rarely invest emotional energy consistently into people they truly feel nothing for. That's what makes their actions important to observe carefully. For example, an avoidant may disappear emotionally for a while, but then suddenly send a message asking if you got home safely. They may struggle with emotional conversations, but still show up during difficult moments in your life. They may avoid talking about feelings directly, yet continue staying emotionally present in quiet ways that reveal attachment underneath their emotional walls, because deep down, many avoidants still crave connection. They simply fear emotional vulnerability at the same time, and this creates emotional inconsistency that confuses the people who love them. One moment they appear caring and emotionally invested. The next moment they seem distant again. But often, the emotional push and pull is not because their feelings disappeared overnight. It's because closeness activates both love and fear simultaneously inside them. That's why their behavior becomes more revealing than their words. Because words require emotional exposure, actions often happen more naturally and honestly. An avoidant may struggle verbalizing love, but their nervous system still reveals attachment through attention, concern, protection, consistency, and emotional returning, especially the returning part. One of the strongest signs of emotional attachment in avoidance is that they often come back emotionally after periods of distance. Not always perfectly, not always consistently. But if someone repeatedly reconnects, checks on you, remembers you, or maintains emotional ties despite struggling with closeness, it usually reveals unresolved emotional attachment underneath their avoidance. But this is important to understand carefully. Recognizing their attachment does not mean ignoring unhealthy patterns or abandoning your own emotional needs. Love should not become endless emotional confusion where you constantly settle for breadcrumbs while hoping someone eventually changes. Emotional awareness matters on both sides. Still, many people misunderstand avoidance completely because they judge only what is spoken while ignoring what is quietly shown. And avoidants often express care through behavior long before they feel emotionally safe enough to fully express it verbally. That's why paying attention to patterns matters more than listening only to emotionally limited words. Because sometimes the person who struggles most to say, "I love you" directly is secretly revealing it through every small action they cannot stop themselves from doing. One of the deepest misunderstandings about avoidant people is believing they are afraid of love itself. In reality, many avoidants are not running from love. They are running from the emotional vulnerability, dependence, and loss of control they associate with love. And that difference changes everything, because when an avoidant truly starts loving someone, they often experience two completely opposite emotional desires at the same time. Part of them wants closeness deeply. They want connection, intimacy, understanding, and emotional safety, just like anyone else. But another part of them becomes terrified of what that closeness might eventually cost emotionally. That internal conflict creates the push and pull behavior many people struggle to understand. See, avoidants often learn very early in life that emotional dependence feels unsafe. Maybe vulnerability once led to disappointment, rejection, emotional pressure, criticism, or loss of personal freedom. So over time, their nervous system adapted by valuing independence above emotional attachment. Independence became protection. Control became safety. This became emotional survival. And because of that, real love can feel emotionally overwhelming for them. Not because the connection is weak, but because the connection is becoming powerful enough to threaten the emotional walls they built for self-protection. That's why many avoidants begin acting differently the deeper feelings become. They may suddenly need more space. They may withdraw emotionally after intimacy. They may seem confused about the relationship, right when things feel strongest. And to the person loving them, it feels heartbreaking because the behavior appears contradictory. One moment the connection feels real, warm, and emotionally intimate. The next moment they become distant, cold, or emotionally unavailable. But internally they are often battling fear, because deep attachment creates emotional risk. The closer someone gets emotionally, the more potential there is for pain, disappointment, rejection, or emotional dependence. And for avoidance, dependence itself often feels terrifying. They fear losing themselves inside relationships. Fear becoming emotionally controlled by love. Fear needing someone too deeply. So instead of fully relaxing into connection, they instinctively create distance to regain emotional control again. That's why avoidants often appear most distant precisely when the relationship matters most. Not because they feel nothing, but because they feel too much. And sadly, many people misinterpret this fear response as lack of love entirely. They assume emotional withdrawal means the avoidant never cared. But often, the emotional withdrawal is happening because the connection is activating unresolved fears around vulnerability and emotional reliance. This is why emotional pressure usually makes avoidants retreat further. The more trapped they feel emotionally, the stronger their instinct becomes to protect their independence. Demands for constant reassurance, emotional intensity, or pressure for immediate closeness can accidentally trigger their fear system, even when love is present, because internally, they are trying to balance two competing emotional needs at once: the desire for connection and the fear of losing emotional freedom. That conflict creates exhaustion inside them. Part of them wants to stay close to you. Another part keeps telling them to regain distance before they become too emotionally vulnerable. And unless they become self-aware about these patterns, they may continue repeating cycles of closeness and withdrawal in relationships without fully understanding why. That's why loving an avoidant requires emotional wisdom. Not blind chasing, not emotional force, but understanding that their distance may come from fear of emotional dependence rather than absence of care. Still, it is important to remember this truth. You cannot heal someone's fear of intimacy for them. They must eventually confront their own emotional patterns themselves. But when an avoidant starts pulling away while simultaneously staying emotionally attached, do not ignore the possibility that what they are truly fighting is not love itself, but the terrifying feeling of needing someone more deeply than they know how to handle. One of the most painful things about loving an avoidant person is the silence, the sudden emotional distance, the unanswered, the feeling that someone who once felt emotionally close now seems completely unavailable. And naturally, silence feels like rejection to most people. It feels like proof that the connection no longer matters. But with avoidance, silence does not always mean they stop caring. Sometimes silence means they became emotionally overwhelmed. And understanding that difference is important, because avoidants often process emotions internally instead of outwardly. When feelings become too intense, too vulnerable, or emotionally complicated, their first instinct is often not communication. It is retreat. They pull inward emotionally to regain control of themselves. See, Many avoidants never learned how to comfortably sit inside emotional vulnerability. Deep emotions may activate anxiety, fear, confusion, pressure, or emotional overload inside them. And instead of openly expressing those feelings, they try to regulate themselves by creating space. That space becomes silence. Not always because they want to hurt someone, but because emotionally they feel flooded. And when people on the other side experience that silence, they often panic. They assume the avoidant no longer cares. So they chase harder emotionally. More texts, more demands for reassurance, more pressure for immediate answers. But unfortunately, emotional pressure often intensifies the avoidance overwhelm instead of calming it. Because when avoidants feel emotionally cornered, their nervous system often interprets closeness as pressure rather than comfort. That's why silence can become longer after emotional conflict or emotional intensity. The avoidant is often trying to emotionally stabilize internally before reconnecting again. They withdraw to process emotions privately because vulnerability feels difficult for them to navigate openly in real time. And this creates one of the most emotionally confusing dynamics in relationships. The person who wants reassurance seeks more connection during emotional stress. The avoidant seeks more distance during emotional stress. Both people are trying to feel emotionally safe, but they move in opposite directions. That does not mean the avoidant feels nothing during silence. In fact, many avoidants think about the relationship constantly while appearing emotionally detached externally. They replay conversations in their minds. They feel guilt. They feel attachment. They feel confusion. But instead of expressing those emotions openly, they often isolate themselves emotionally until the intensity settles, because silence feels safer than vulnerability. And sadly, many people misunderstand that silence completely. They assume no communication means no feelings, but avoidants often suppress emotions rather than express them directly. Their emotional world may remain very active internally, even while externally they appear distant or disconnected. Still, this is important to understand clearly. Silence should not become an excuse for unhealthy emotional neglect. Understanding avoidant behavior does not mean abandoning your own emotional needs or accepting endless emotional inconsistency without boundaries. Healthy communication still matters. Emotional accountability still matters. But interpreting every moment of silence as proof of lost love may cause you to misunderstand what is actually happening emotionally inside an avoidant person. Because many avoidants were taught, consciously or unconsciously, that emotions are something to manage privately rather than share openly. So when vulnerability becomes overwhelming, retreat becomes their coping mechanism. Not because they stop caring, but because they do not yet know how to stay emotionally present while feeling deeply vulnerable at the same time. And sometimes, the silence that hurts you. Most is not empty at all. It is simply the only way an emotionally overwhelmed person knows how to protect themselves from feelings they have never fully learned how to handle. One of the biggest mistakes people make when loving an avoidant person is trying to force emotional closeness through pressure. They believe more talking, more emotional intensity, more reassurance, and more demands for connection will finally make the avoidant feel secure enough to open up. But most of the time, pressure does the exact opposite. It pushes them further away, because avoidants are extremely sensitive to emotional overwhelm. The moment a relationship starts feeling emotionally heavy, demanding, or emotionally consuming, their nervous system often reacts by creating distance to protect itself. Not always because they do not care, but because closeness begins feeling emotionally unsafe. That's why peace matters so much with avoidance. The calmer, safer, and less pressured the emotional environment feels, the easier it becomes for them to slowly lower their walls, because deep down, avoidants are not usually searching for emotional chaos. They are searching for emotional safety without losing themselves in the process. And emotional safety feels very different from emotional pressure. Safety says you're accepted here. Pressure says, You must respond exactly how I need right now. Safety allows space, pressure creates fear. That's why avoidants often open up more naturally around emotionally grounded people. People who communicate calmly. People who do not react impulsively to every emotional shift. People who create understanding instead of emotional intensity in small ways over time, because now the relationship feels safer instead of threatening. And this is where many people accidentally sabotage avoidance without realizing it. The moment the avoidant pulls away slightly, panic begins. Fear takes over. Emotional chasing starts. The other person seeks immediate reassurance because distance feels terrifying to them. But unfortunately, intense emotional reactions often confirm the avoidant's deepest fear, that closeness leads to emotional pressure and loss of freedom. So they retreat further, not because they wanted to stop loving you, but because they no longer feel emotionally safe inside the intensity. That's why emotional calmness becomes incredibly powerful. A peaceful presence creates emotional trust over time. It tells the avoidant, you do not have to perform perfectly here. You are not being emotionally trapped. You are allowed to breathe emotionally while we build connection. And that emotional freedom matters deeply to avoidants, because underneath their walls is often someone terrified of vulnerability, terrified of losing independence, and terrified of disappointing people emotionally. So when they finally experience connection without constant pressure attached to it, they begin associating love with safety instead of fear. That changes relationships completely, because real emotional safety allows avoidance to slowly confront vulnerability without immediately feeling the need to escape. They begin learning that intimacy does not always mean emotional suffocation, that love does not always lead to losing themselves. Still, this does not mean becoming emotionally silent about your own needs or accepting emotional neglect forever. Healthy relationships still require communication effort and emotional accountability from both people. But avoidance rarely open through force. They open through trust, through consistency, through emotional calmness, through feeling emotionally accepted rather than emotionally cornered. And sometimes the very thing that finally makes an avoidant feel safe enough to love openly is not emotional pressure at all, but the peaceful feeling of being close to someone who never made love feel like a trap. One of the biggest turning points in any relationship with an avoidant person happens the moment you stop chasing the connection and start reconnecting with yourself. Because as long as your emotional energy is fully consumed trying to force closeness, seek reassurance, or constantly pull them back emotionally, the relationship often becomes trapped inside a cycle of pressure and retreat. You chase harder. They pull away further. You panic more. They need more distance. And both people end up emotionally exhausted. That's why the real shift begins when you stop making the relationship the center of your emotional survival. Not because you stop caring, not because you become cold, but because you finally understand something important. Forcing emotional closeness rarely creates genuine emotional safety for an avoidant person. In fact, it often activates their fear even more. Avoidants are highly sensitive to emotional pressure. The more emotionally trapped they feel, the stronger their instinct becomes to regain space and independence. So when someone constantly chases reassurance, pushes for emotional intensity, or demands immediate closeness during moments of distance, the avoidant nervous system often reacts by shutting down further. That's why stepping back changes the dynamic completely. Because when emotional pressure disappears, space for reflection finally appears. Suddenly, the avoidant is no longer reacting defensively to emotional intensity every second. They are no longer focused only on escaping pressure. Instead, they finally have room to emotionally process the connection itself. And this is where many avoidants begin becoming more aware of your value, because absence creates emotional clarity. When your energy is no longer constantly chasing them, they start feeling the emotional difference between having your presence and not having it. They begin noticing your calmness, your support, your consistency, your emotional warmth. Things that may have been emotionally drowned out before by fear, pressure, or emotional overwhelm suddenly become more visible internally. And ironically, that emotional awareness often grows strongest when you stop trying so hard to force it. Because emotional chasing can unintentionally prevent an avoidant from fully feeling their own attachment. The relationship becomes centered around managing pressure instead of experiencing connection naturally. But once the pressure fades, their true emotions often become easier for them to recognize. Still, this only works when your detachment is real, not fake silence while secretly obsessing every second, not pretending to move on just to provoke a reaction. Real emotional stability means genuinely reconnecting with your own peace, your own identity, and your own life outside the relationship. That inner shift changes your energy completely. You stop reacting from fear. You stop measuring your worth by someone's emotional availability. You stop abandoning yourself emotionally trying to keep someone close. And that confidence feels different to an avoidant person. Because emotionally grounded people feel safer than emotionally desperate people. Calmness lowers defenses. Emotional independence removes pressure, and suddenly, the avoidant no longer feels emotionally trapped inside the relationship dynamic. Now they can breathe emotionally again. And often, that emotional breathing space is exactly what allows deeper feelings to finally surface. But perhaps the most important truth is this. Emotional detachment benefits you, whether the avoidant comes closer or not. Because the moment you stop chasing someone who keeps running, you begin reclaiming your own emotional freedom. You reconnect with your confidence, your peace, your self-worth, your emotional stability. And that healing matters more than any relationship outcome, because real love should never require abandoning yourself completely just to keep someone emotionally available. And sometimes, the moment you stop forcing connection and finally choose your own emotional peace is the exact moment. The avoidant finally realizes how deeply your presence truly mattered to them all along.